Poland. Now, of course, the Germans first deported the Polish people in World War II. During World War II, Nazi Germany deported 2.5 million Polish citizens from the Polish areas annexed by Nazi Germany, and murdered another 5.5 million Poles and Polish Jews, and resettled 1.3 million ethnic Germans in their place. Around 500,000 Germans were stationed in Poland as part of its occupation force. In early 1945, there were an estimated 11 million Germans east of the German-Poland international border. Well, the first mass flight of Germans followed the Red Army's advance, and it was made up of both spontaneous flight driven by rumors of Soviet atrocities of plundering and pillaging the civilian population, but it also consisted of organized evacuations that started in the summer of 1944 and continued through the spring of 1945. About 1% of the German civilian population east of the German-Polish border died in fighting prior to the surrender in May 1945. These areas were occupied by the Soviet Red Army in mid-1945, and many German civilians were sent as reparations labor to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union transferred former German territories in the east of the German-Polish border back to Poland in July 1945. In mid-1945, about 4.5 million Germans remained on the territories under Polish control. Early expulsions in Poland were undertaken by the Polish communist military authorities in order to create an ethnically homogeneous Poland, as envisioned by the Polish communists. Between 700 and 800,000 Germans were affected. In the February 1946 census of Poland, about 2.3 million persons were listed as Germans, and from then on, the expulsions became better organized, affecting the remaining German population. By 1950, approximately 3 million Germans had been expelled, and about 1 million were naturalized as Polish citizens. Those Germans that remained were considered indispensable for the Polish economy, but nearly all had left by 1960. So right after the war, many Germans were employed as forced labor in communist-administered camps, and some of these camps were reused German concentration camps. So this is largely what happened to Danzig due to these population transfers. Now, Danzig suffered major damage at the end of World War II. Throughout the war, the ancient city of Danzig, or at least the medieval core of the city, suffered relatively little damage from enemy attacks. Even a bombing raid that was carried out by more than 1,000 American B-52 Flying Fortresses in October 1944 left the city untouched because it only targeted shipbuilding facilities. But towards the end of the war, Russian artillery bombardments and concentrated Allied bombs rained down on the city that caused a great loss of life among the civilian population. The bombardments only caused some minor damage to the inner city, but not serious enough to hurt most of the ancient buildings. But those that survived and couldn't escape had to face the Soviet army, which captured the heavily damaged city on March 30th, followed by large-scale raping and looting. And the Red Army is believed to have set the ancient city on fire, and we don't know if this is accidental or on purpose. And some of the buildings, like the Kramtor or Crane Gate, that were made entirely out of centuries-old dried timber, burnt especially fast. An inferno followed in the old quarter of the city, and the fire was so fierce that the bells of old churches like St. Catherine, St. John, St. Brigitte, Barbara, Elizabeth, Peter, and Paul, the bells of these churches melted in the belfries and dropped down without a clang. After the city suffered its devastation at the end of the war, as many cities had, it was occupied by the Russians, and rebuilding slowly began. This was a much longer process of rebuilding that happened in places, especially in Germany, that were rebuilt and modernized in less than 7 years after the war. In Danzig, reconstruction happened later, and really only restored the city after the 1960s. Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. This is where the population transfer and the occupation of Polish people and the transformation of the city begins. Already before the end of World War II, the Yalta Conference between Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill agreed to place Danzig, now called Gdańsk, under the de facto administration of Poland, and this decision was confirmed at the Potsdam Conference. A Polish administration was set up in the devastated city on March 30th, 1945. New Polish residents were settled in Gdańsk, with 3,200 in April and more than 4,000 in May and June of 1945. As of 1948, more than two-thirds of the 150,000 inhabitants came from central Poland, about 15 to 18% from Polish-speaking areas east of the Curzon Line that were annexed by the Soviet Union after World War II. The deportation of the German population started in July 1945, so the pre-war population of the city was a small minority. Well, with this rapid transformation, some people tried to hold on to the memory of what Danzig or Gdańsk was like before the war. The members of the pre-war Polish minority in the city, which was, again, only like 10% of the population, organized associations dedicated to upholding their past traditions and history. Between 1952 and the late 1960s, Polish artisans restored a lot of the old city's architecture, which up to 90% of it was destroyed in the war. The reconstruction of parts of the inner city was controversial because it was tied so closely to German identity. And you can imagine, with many people living there who they themselves had suffered directly under the Nazis. So as a result of anti-German sentiments, and the new settlers of the city who were mostly indifferent toward an old quarter that they never knew, a modern architecture was preferred. And the decision to reconstruct a traditional old town was politically motivated in order to symbolize the city's reunification with Poland. So the old town and other historical districts were mostly built up with modern architecture. And the reconstruction wasn't tied to the city's pre-war appearance. So instead, the purpose was to rebuild an idealized, traditional Polish style of architecture. 19th and early 20th century architecture and traces of German tradition were ignored or regarded as what was called Prussian barbarism. Styles in the Dutch, Italian, and French traditions were emphasized. German names of streets, buildings, shipyards, and districts were changed to Polish names. City districts were renamed, and sometimes these names came from medieval Polish records, and sometimes they were translations from German terms. So that is the city as it is today. There was largely a process of trying to transform it from German into Polish. The city, which was founded due to German Eastern migration, was ironically occupied in the 20th century by Polish people who migrated west from the Polish hinterland to this new city of Gdańsk. So the history of Danzig, or Gdańsk, is one of mass population movements and how a new population tries to alter and change the memory of the old population which is no longer there. This is something we don't see a lot of in Western Europe, but it's a story that's played out multiple times throughout history, and Danzig or Gdańsk gives us a good clue into what this process is like. Well, Melissa, thank you so much for the question. I appreciate it, and I love to get audience questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. All right. Well, that is the episode for today, and I really appreciate you listening because it's you, the audience, that makes this show happen. And it's also you, the audience, that grows this show. First of all, I'd like to thank the Knowlton's Rangers, and especially our spy masters, Baron Fraser, Carl from Norway, Chris from Maine, Moondoggy from Ohio, and Rick Knowlton, and I'll explain what that means in a second. If you would like to help support this show and help it reach new listeners who haven't discovered it yet, there's 4 easy ways for you to do it. First, subscribe to the show and leave us a review on the listening app of your choice. If you want to do that, you can go to historyunpluggedpodcast.com. 2, like us on Facebook and share posts about new episodes. 3, check out sponsors for the show. This is the best way to help me pay the bills because if sponsors see the audience is interested in their products, they will keep advertising. 4, you can become a member of the Knowlton's Rangers. The Knowlton's Rangers were an elite reconnaissance and espionage detachment of the Continental Army in the Revolutionary War, but it's also the name of the History Unplugged membership program. Learn how to join by going to patreon.com/unplugged. So here's what you get if you become one of the Knowlton's Rangers. If you join at the level of Scout, you can get early access to new podcast episodes, along with enjoying absolutely every single episode of the History Unplugged podcast ad-free. All 270 and counting episodes. If you join at the level of Intelligence Officer, you can also get access to premium episodes, like a multi-part series on the life of Audie Murphy, the most decorated combat soldier in World War II, or the 10-part series Ottoman Lives, a series that looks at the cast of characters that made up the Ottoman Empire, such as the Sultan, the Eunuch, the harem servant girl, and the soldier. And finally, if you join at the level of Spy Master, you get all the same stuff as the Scouts and Intelligence Officers, but you also get a shout-out to you and or your business at the end of each episode, a 3-pack of hardcover history books, plus you'll be put at the very front of the line for me to answer your question about history, and I can guarantee I will dedicate an episode that's about an hour long or so to your question. Sign up at patreon.com/unplugged. Again, that's patreon.com/unplugged. Anyway, those are the ways you can help out the show. Thank you so much for your support. Thanks for listening to the History Unplugged podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get your daily dose of all things history related, from ancient Greece to the Cold War. We'll see you next time at the History Unplugged podcast.